Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new The Hacker Factory podcast with hacker maker Phillip Wylie. You're about to discover what the role of a professional hacker entails, the different specializations it holds, and what it takes to learn and become one. Enjoy the conversation as Phillip and guests unveil the secrets of professional hacking, a mysterious, intriguing, and often misunderstood occupation. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
BugCrowd's award-winning platform combines actionable contextual intelligence with the skill and experience of the world's most elite hackers to help leading organizations identify and fix vulnerabilities, protect customers, and make the digitally connected world a safer place. Learn more at bugcrowd.com.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Hacker Factory podcast. I'm your host, Phillip Wylie, the Hacker Maker. In each episode, I have a person with a unique journey into cybersecurity, and hopefully their stories will resonate with you. And this episode, I've got someone on that's a friend of mine that I've met through the cybersecurity community. He does a lot of speaking. Great person and a great person to have on the show because he really is big on mentoring and helping others get started out. So thanks for joining, Matt.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Phillip. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So I hail from the Cincinnati, Ohio area. What I do for a living is I do digital forensics and incident response, primarily on the incident response side, probably mostly, and do a number of other things. As you mentioned, I do a lot of public speaking, different conferences and so forth. I also run a local information security meetup group in the Cincinnati area called the SIMPA Security SIG, and we meet the third Thursday of every month from 6:30 p.m. our local Eastern time to 9 p.m. And also do a lot of other things. A hacking is not a crime advocate, and I'm a technical mentor for WAMSA, which is the Women's Security Alliance.
Yeah, thanks for sharing about yourself. And just kind of before we kind of get in your story, just to share with people, incident response and digital forensics is a very important area for those who don't understand. That's kind of when companies get breached, then someone has to come in and investigate it and all that. So would you mind sharing what digital forensics and incident response is?
Sure. So digital forensics and incident response is to look for a suspected breach. And a lot of times those are things that get reported through like an automated system, some sort of alerting notification, and sometimes those things spill into ticketing systems. And those can come from a number of sources. So those can come from things like endpoint detection and response, network detection and response, your IDS and IPS systems looking for intrusions. And sometimes these things are driven by thresholds. Sometimes they're driven by activity. And really, it's to answer the who, what, where, why, when, and how questions when you're looking into something to try to understand, have you been breached? Have you been compromised? Are you under an active attack? And then figuring out really from there, once you've established those things, answered those questions, what actions then do you take? And it's definitely a discipline that requires a lot of different areas of knowledge, and it's for me it's exciting because it's always sort of in the trenches. You're always where the action is. So I think sometimes with penetration testing things move along. Most pen testers I know, report writing isn't maybe their favorite thing to do, but what's interesting then with incident response is that you always have something going on. You're always looking into something or, working to improve your skills. I think when you get into like red team and doing adversarial emulation, those essentially are long ramp up times to basically try to act the way a threat actor would for a relatively short amount of time. And it seems like they probably spend a lot more time in the preparation of that than they do actually carrying out the engagement. So that's what I like about instant response, is just that sort of hands-on, always something happening, always something worth looking at, and just sort of being on the forefront of where an attack might be, and trying to make those determinations and help figure out what the action is.
Yeah, that's pretty cool, because you're working in one area of cybersecurity that you're actually have the opportunity to investigate and deal with actual attackers, whereas some areas you really don't deal that much with it. So that sounds pretty exciting.
Yeah, for me, it's sort of the fun thing, and it's always fun. I always tell people, repeat after me, attribution is hard. And when I get that response back, I usually smile and say, yes, it is. But you try to do that to the best of your ability. And sometimes you may not always understand the true origin of an attack. For example, somebody's behind a VPN node or a Tor exit node, it's going to be very difficult, if not near impossible, to really know where those things started. It almost has to be an incident of epic proportions where you might have like a law enforcement involved or something like that. Fortunately, most of the things you're investigating aren't that serious. You do see a lot of noise things. That is, sometimes there are vulnerability scanners, for example, that are essentially looking at your entire internet footprint to try to understand, is there something vulnerable that we can attack further? And sometimes it's trying to head those things off at the pass. And those are things you might look to try to figure out, can we block this? How do we stop this from happening?
Yeah, that's one of the things too. A lot of people that are drawn to pen testing or red teaming really like puzzles and a challenge, and it seems like you get a lot of that in incident response.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. There's a whole lot of piecing things together. And I think the other thing I like about incident response is you almost need a little bit of a jack of all trades sort of background to be effective at the job. And what I mean by that is that it helps if you have sort of a systems administration kind of background and a sort of blue team defending things type of background, because you have to understand what defense capabilities are and then how they work, and in order to make recommendations. By the same token, you also have to know a certain amount of offensive security, just because you have to know what type of attacks are being leveraged against you and understand how those work. And I'm not saying I can do either of those at a full-time level. Nobody would mistake me, for example, for a full-time penetration tester or a red teamer, somebody who does offensive security for a living. I'm not at that level. If I had time and enough energy to focus on that specifically, then I'm sure I could get to that level, but it would take some time to do so. But I have a decent enough understanding of the fundamentals that it really helps me do all of those things. And then you add another layer with incident response, which is knowing how to investigate and trying to understand what happened and looking for things that are bad. And sometimes they're not just technical things. I can think of a very recent example where I saw some stuff that looked like some really weird testing going on. It was eyebrow raising, and the person that I was looking at, you wouldn't think they would be somebody who would be specifically doing a whole lot around offensive security, but they were definitely in the security space. And so sometimes you just reach out to a person and ask and say, hey, here's what we're seeing. This looks kind of weird. Can you explain what's going on here? And so these interpersonal things, I think, is another thing that sort of is a differentiator with incident response. Is sometimes you just have to go talk to people. because you could spend hours and hours and hours trying to investigate something and understand what happened. Sometimes you can get a quick explanation and like, oh yeah, here I was testing this completely other thing that I didn't mean to trigger this kind of alert, and they'll send you a link to the article that's maybe from Microsoft, for example, and you can see the command that they're executing right in that same article. And so at that point, you can put the thing to rest. That's a whole lot easier than digging through sort of the technical artifacts for hours and hours upon end. You have to use good judgment, I think, as part of that. So it's one of the things where you have to have some interpersonal skills. And normally when we think of that in the security space, we're thinking of like social engineering and, those sort of, engagements that can also include physical penetration tests, things of that nature. But incident response, you actually get a little bit of that as well.
That's kind of interesting too, because I don't have much experience in that area, but I know that there's a lot of cases things aren't always the way it seems, because I had one of my first security jobs. We did a little bit of everything, and there was some suspicious stuff going on that this software vendor was reporting to us, and come to find out it wasn't anything malicious. This developer that we had was just kind of downloading the source code and stuff and trying to reverse engineer and figure out how it worked. And we thought this guy was up to something nefarious or something. So we investigated, and then come to find out when they talked to the guy, says, no, I was just trying to figure out how the software worked. He was just downloading source code and, reverse engineering it. So it wasn't anything bad at all. But, I'm sure you run into a lot of cases of things like that. Someone's doing something and it just looks scary.
Indeed. And it's funny that you mentioned that kind of an example. So I gave a talk. I've given it a number of places. It's called Lend Me Your IRs. And it was really my 3 favorite incident response investigations. And the first example I give was an unknown attachment that looked an awful lot like a known attack, which was the flawed Amy Rat, which is part of the Nakurs botnet. And so why it was newsworthy was because it was targeting banks, but it was using Microsoft Publisher files. And that's just not normally a file type you associate with the most common payloads. It's very common to see, Word files, even HTML file attachments, Excels with, or spreadsheets with macros that can do all sorts of malicious, nefarious things. And even to an extent, Adobe PDF files have had sort of that history. But it was kind of attention grabbing because it was Microsoft Publisher. And it was funny because I talk about all this stuff I did to investigate this file. And the reason I was looking so heavily at the file is because I had a visitor come up to my desk and they were saying, hey, one of our VIPs got this email attachment. They tried to open it up on their smartphone and need to understand what happened here. Need you to drop whatever you're doing and we'll get you this attachment right away. We need to try to understand what happened here. And so when they first came over, I'm like, yeah, okay, I'll look into it. No problem. But then as they stood there and they kept talking and, all of a sudden their anxiety just, sort of transferred onto me, and then I started kind of getting worked up, and I got this tunnel vision looking at this attachment, and I spent all this time looking at the attachment and was just almost to the point of being ready to just throw in the towel, go confiscate the device, shut it down, throw it in the forensics lab, and then get the person issued a new device and move on. And the last moment I just thought, oh, well, this is silly because it can easily be spoofed, but I should really look at the EXIF data. And I did, and it turned out it came from our test phishing vendor. Now, I didn't just take that at face value because it could be spoofed. I actually went through the mail server logs and actually, pulled the headers and validated that, yes, it really did originate from our test phishing vendor. But that was one of those situations where it was kind of a painful lesson, and especially painful for me because I've given a talk at a number of places called phishing forensics? Is it just suspicious or is it malicious? In all of those cases, I always start with the email message headers. And the one time I don't, because I had this person get me so tunnel vision focused on the attachment, I lost sight of my standard processes and procedures. And I spent literally hours looking at something that I should have been able to close out in minutes. But those are the painful lessons you learn. So then the next time when they roll around, you don't make that same mistake twice.
Yeah, sometimes those hard lessons learned are some of the most valuable ones. When you miss that process or you don't think about the basics, then we run into stuff like that. So we kind of jumped into some of this stuff since it's really, really interesting topic to me and one that I really don't know enough about. But kind of, how did you get into digital forensics and incident response? How did you get into that?
That's a great question. So I guess I should probably start back with my InfoSec journey. Growing up as a kid, computers weren't necessarily everywhere. Most of the communication that probably happened, from site to another site happened over modem, for example. And, I was just enthralled with computers and computer technology and microcomputers really starting to come of age at that time. And being a kid, it was new and exciting. That's how I viewed it. I was just always amazed at the technical wizards that could take something and sort of bend it to their will, and it would respond and do what they wanted. And it would sometimes be things that the designers never had in mind. And it was just, so always fascinating. And then, the movie War Games came out, and that was just, next level. It was just exciting. And it was, those early childhood memories and working with computers and, some of the early video game consoles that, even ones that predate Nintendo, it was where the interest probably sparked. And then around 1995, I got a hold of an Information Week magazine article, and Dan Farmer had authored Satan, which is the security analysis tool for analyzing networks. And he was really making a lot of headlines because he'd released this for free. And so for people listening, if they're familiar with Tenable's Nessus scanner, they're familiar with things like Metasploit. Before those things existed, really the security analysis tool for analyzing networks was the first open source utility that would scan for multiple vulnerabilities, and he had released it for free. So there was a big debate happening at the time of whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, who was using it and for what purposes. People could use it to secure their networks, but they could also use it to try to break into networks. So it was a real novel concept. But what really struck me is that he was working for Sun Microsystems at the time, and his entire job was computer security. Back in 1995, that really wasn't a career path. I never heard of anybody else that had a job focusing specifically on computer security. And so for me, I thought that was the most exciting thing. And for anybody listening, I hope they don't get discouraged if they have a hard time landing that first information security job, because it's really hard. It's probably one of the hardest job moves I ever had to make. In fact, it took me literally 20 years to make that 1995 until 2015 when I got my very first information security job opportunity. And what I did along the way is I spent a lot of time paying my dues, working in IT, did systems administration for quite a number of years. I'd always been really interested in information security, went to a ton of conferences, went to a lot of meetup events and so forth, but I wasn't real good at networking per se, because I mostly kept to myself, except for people that I knew who they were. I could maybe go and talk to them just to let them know how much I appreciated their work and their research and their information sharing. And some pretty prominent people in the industry that it wasn't really till a little bit later then I kind of got out of my shell a little bit, and I gave a talk at DerbyCon 5, was the first big security conference talk I gave. And it was shortly after that I actually got the opportunity to get in an information security job. So for me, it was kind of going from that system administration side to really doing security by extension, just on what that job was, until I had enough relationship established. And if I had known back then that speak at a conference like DerbyCon, a high profile conference, was the instant credibility I needed to get a job opportunity, I probably wouldn't have waited so long. But that's kind of how it happened. And I was previously more of a security jack of all trades before the role I have now. And so I kind of had a chance to do a lot of things, from vulnerability management, and also doing some AppSec stuff to do manual validation, because just because a vulnerability scanner says something's vulnerable or not vulnerable doesn't mean that's really the case. Some things you have to look at firsthand and learn how to do that. So I've done a little bit of that stuff, but for me, it was just sort of that excitement, I think, of always being on the front lines and tearing into and trying to answer the question. And where I was at with a previous employer, it was only a small part of what I did, but I was really the only person we had that was, capable of doing the incident response and, looking at log files, pouring through the SIM, looking at packets, understanding what's happened, and had enough time spent studying offensive security to know sort of what I was looking for. And so that was really what I wanted to focus on. And fortunately, it worked out for me.
So for anyone that's wanting to get into digital forensics and incident response, what would you recommend?
I would recommend a number of things. So make sure you really understand systems at the host level. Make sure you know Linux and Windows pretty well. There are certain things you should know, like how to look at processes that are running on those kind of systems. And knowing the commands and the tools or utilities you would do, or you would use for that, rather. And for example, just knowing in Linux that the most of your log files are going to live under /var/log. Knowing in Windows, for example, that the 4 base logs are going to be application, setup, security, and system. And just knowing how to kind of look at those logs. I would recommend anybody have at least a basic knowledge of knowing how to look at packets in like Wireshark utility, something like that. Spend some time looking at PCAPs, and if you can find online exercises, more power to you. I think right now it seems like there are a lot of ranges, CTFs, and that sort of thing, and they tend to slant a little heavy to the offensive security side. So one of the options that's out there in NISA, ENISA, is basically part of the European Union, and they actually have some great free resources out there. So they have some technical training, and with those you can download the virtual machines, and they're pretty lightweight, so you don't need a monster system to run these. They also have the lab guides and really all the training modules that you need. Really everything is there, and it's absolutely free. So for American audiences, you may have to get used to looking at international English. So some words are spelled a little differently, for example. You may have to get comfortable with, UTC logs and, things that are in Greenwich Mean Time, as opposed to, Eastern Standard, Central Time, or Pacific Standard Time, that type of thing. But once you get past those things, they've got really awesome training resources that are out there absolutely free. The other thing I would caution people of about ENISA is that they get into some legal aspects. And so some of those European laws don't necessarily translate to United States law. So you always have to know that there's probably going to be some overlap there, but also take all of those things with a little bit of a grain of salt, because some of the laws are going to be a little bit different from from European Union law to what's legal there versus the United States. But for the most part, the training is really good stuff, and really good places to start, I think.
So in digital forensics and incident response, a lot of other areas of security, sometimes certs can be important. Is that area, is it important to have certifications?
So I think this is a debate that rages a lot, and I see and appreciate all aspects of what people are saying. Um, I think having some good base certifications is probably a good thing. Um, CompTIA, I think, has some good vendor neutral certifications. If there's a specific employer that you're dying to get into the door to, and people that work there, and you might know, for example, that they're a diehard Cisco shop, just as an example, then getting those vendor certs might carry a little more weight. But then again, if you have those Cisco certs, you're applying to somewhere that predominantly uses Palo Alto security devices, it can kind of hurt you there. So, if you're just sort of looking within a specific market space, I think probably the vendor neutral certs are probably the best type of things to look at. I will say this. I have actually talked to and helped interview some candidates that had some very impressive looking certs. But then when we quiz them on basic, working level knowledge, they've fallen a little flat. So I wouldn't recommend probably depending entirely too much on certifications. They have a good chance of getting you an interview, but really your personality and your knowledge are the types of things that'll get you a job. And so what I would encourage people to do, I don't want to discourage anybody from getting a certification, particularly if they're already working on it. They've invested a lot of time, energy, money, resources, whatever it is. But I would just sort of caution them to kind of go beyond the certs. And so for myself, I'm really just looking for people that are passionate, and you don't know that when you see a certification listed, if this person is really passionate about information security, or they were just doing the certification just in the hopes that would help them get a job. You don't really know until you actually start interviewing and talking to those people. The things I think that would excite me are people that participate in things like CTFs. People that will take time to write blog posts or articles that explain what they've learned about information security, and sort of those things I think that are you don't see commonplace, that sort of help demonstrate that here's somebody taking time on their own, not just to pass an exam, but actually spend time really learning something, and then they're sharing that knowledge with others, or they're contributing to other projects. Could even be an open source project. For example, I have a good friend, Miriam Weisner, who does she has a couple open source projects that she's working on, and people that do that are often looking for people to help them. So there's a lot of things that people can do that are a little outside that traditional qualification triangle of experience, education, and certification. So, I would never discourage anybody from education or certification, but there's ways to kind of get experience even if you don't have a job. And so doing things like CTFs and write-ups, or just writing informational things, maybe have a YouTube channel and put out some videos that talk about what you are learning or what you've done. Really just spend some time playing around with stuff and teaching yourself that way. I've given a talk before that was titled "Learn by Doing, Improve by Showing and Telling," and I think there's a lot of useful just in that title. If you take that to heart, that can really help you in your career.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, do by showing, because there was actually a person in our local community that was speaking at one of our local DEF CON group meeting. They're a recent grad, and they did a talk on malware analysis. And one of the hiring managers for a large bank for their incident response department just happened to be watching and asked for his resume. So basically, to a degree, the guy kind of did a technical interview unknowingly. And so, like you mentioned, doing the videos and stuff, even speaking at conferences and for different groups and stuff is very important.
Yeah, that's awesome. And if I can just add real quick, another thing that people should play around with are, particularly if you're looking for digital forensics and incident response, there's a Linux distribution called Remnux that has a lot of fantastic tools in there. I don't think it's the best resource, but even Kali Linux has some forensic tools built into it. But I think Remnux, Sans Sift Workstation, and FireEye has a Windows, basically. I can't really call it a distribution, but basically a platform with a lot of tools built into it that you can add into a Windows VM. And you can even use like an evaluation VM for that purpose. And it's called Flare VM. And that has a lot of great Windows tools. So I think if you play around with those kind of things, you learn the tools that are in those. And, there's plenty of material for people that want to give a talk or write about those kind of things. But those have fantastic digital forensics tools, malware analysis tools, those sort of things that will, essentially get you the skills that you really need to, impress people, especially if they're looking for that type of talent and having a hard time sourcing it.
Oh, very, very good. Very interesting advice. So we're getting down towards the end of the show. Is there anything you'd like to share that we haven't discussed so far?
I just want to thank you very much for the time. I really enjoyed doing this. I could probably sit here and do this for hours on end. I enjoy it so much, but it's been nice hearing from folks. So anybody wants to follow me online on social media, my Twitter handle is @Circa, which is @C3RKAH. So if anybody would like to follow me there, anytime I have speaking engagements at a conference coming up or a meetup group I'm running, or really pretty much anything I'm doing, that's strictly an InfoSec handle. So anybody can follow me there and sort of see what I'm up to. And if I'm ever going somewhere where any of your listeners are, definitely come talk to me. Hit me up. I love talking with people. If anybody has questions, advice, or just wants to banter on things that I've done or what they're doing, love to talk to people. So definitely feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. It was an honor to have you as a guest. And for those wanting to get in touch with Matt, we'll have his Twitter in the show notes, so make it easier for you to find. So thanks again, Matt.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been great. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you on the next episode.
BugCrowd's award-winning platform combines actionable contextual intelligence with the skill and experience of the world's most elite hackers to help leading organizations identify and fix vulnerabilities, protect customers, and make the digitally connected world a safer place. Learn more at bugcrowd.com.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Hacker Factory podcast with Phillip Wylie. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.